Greetings, everyone. So we are going to be getting started shortly. I'm going to give folks some time to join us, so we'll be getting started in about 3 to 4 minutes. Again, we'll be getting started shortly. I'm just going to give some folks time to join us in about 3 to 4 minutes. Thanks. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for your patience. So let's get started with today's webinar. My name is Sal Munoz. I am the System Implementation Manager with All Chicago, and today we are going to be talking through the sheltered pre-point count. So the point in time count, the sheltered pre-point in time count. So this will be prepping you for the upcoming pre-point count pre-pit count that'll be occurring on Thursday, October 31st. And this pre-pit count is really there to sort of shake off the cobwebs in anticipation of the actual pit count, which occurs on in the last week of January, which will provide the date for in the upcoming weeks. So let's move forward. So a few housekeeping rules today. We have the handout section where I have uploaded one PDF of the slides that we'll be presenting today. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to use the questions functionality. I won't necessarily be unmuting anyone or looking at the chat function. So again, if you have any questions, if you want to know something, please use the questions function. I will be addressing questions on a sort of rolling basis throughout all of this. So keep that in mind. And I will be getting to your questions throughout. So if you do have a question that gets raised, go ahead, send it in, and I'll answer it probably right then and there. We have enough time for it today. So for our webinar today, we're going to be talking through what the PIT actually is, what kind of data is used for the sheltered count, the 2019 PIT results, and how to do data entry for both singles and families, and then get into a few details in terms of what to expect for the pre-PIT on October 31st, and then we'll send you off with a couple of resources that you can use at your own agency. So what is the PIT? The point in time count occurs every year on a select day in January, and it's been occurring since 2005. And this is something that's mandated by HUD. It's how they develop their policy, how they gauge how homelessness works in the various continuums that they fund. So it's been a long-term process. It initially started out as something that was much more paper-driven, people actually completing tallies and surveys, and now we still have that component for the unsheltered count, but for the sheltered count, we've now been able to rely more and more on HMIS and systems where folks are inputting their clients into every night so that it sort of eases the administrative burden on agencies. So during the PIT, both unsheltered and sheltered homeless are surveyed in Chicago. And this data, again, is really collected to better understand the needs, and it helps inform the allocation of resources. So this is also something that on a wider scale, it's analyzed on the federal level. It informs where funding is going to go, et cetera. And one thing to keep in mind is that the PIT, for the most part, impacts shelters. It impacts any shelters that use ShelterPoint, permanent supportive housing projects, and rapid rehousing projects, outreach projects. They don't necessarily participate in the point in time count. Now, I take that back. Outreach projects do participate in the point in time count, but they participate on the unsheltered side of things, not necessarily on the sheltered count. So today we are mostly going to be concentrating on the sheltered count. So we're going to be concentrating on the clients that are in your emergency shelters, transitional housing shelters, interim housing shelters, or safe havens. Those are the folks that we're going to be talking about. Now, for the folks that are unsheltered, what the process is there, typically we gather a a group of volunteers to do the count, to go out with some seasoned outreach teams to talk with their clients. So for today, the purpose and the aim is to those shelter providers who have clients that will go there every night and who are sheltering clients. And again, this mostly impacts emergency shelters, interim housing, transitional housing, and safe havens. So what is the pre-PIT? Well, it's really created for the purposes of encouraging agencies to remove any old clients out of their ShelterPoint list well before the night of the PIT. So it's really a good way of being able to sort of shake out your cobwebs. What we tend to find sometimes is that agencies will, depending on the sort of data culture, depending on the the culture that's set by the ATAs, that's set by the program managers and executive directors, sometimes ShelterPoint falls by the wayside. And what we end up seeing is that the certain agencies use ShelterPoint for that one night when we're measuring the pit, and then don't use it again until the next pit happens. And that's not ideal. We would encourage you to use ShelterPoint to its fullest capacity, but this is why we created the pre-pit, so we can identify those providers that have clients that are still checked into their bed, but they may no longer be at the agency itself. And also the pre-pit is a really good way to do a dry run of the actual pit process, and it's helpful in that regard. It's a harmless way of being able to practice something that'll be coming up. So on the night of the pit, what happens? And now we're talking about the actual pit itself and the point in time count on this cold January night. What usually happens is that projects will be taking both a paper tally of their clients and will have the HMIS ShelterPoint data pulled for that night as well. So that when we say the HMIS ShelterPoint data is pulled, that doesn't mean that you have to do the pulling. On our side, the HMIS lead, All Chicago, will automatically pull that data into reports that we'll be sending out the day after. And what we need in that ShelterPoint data is that the data must be reflective of who will be staying that night by midnight. So that's really the big thing. Now midnight, when we say midnight, that's sort of if it's 1 a.m., fine. I know one of the things that we often hear is that, I have a client who works until 12:30. They get in at 1 a.m., but we can pretty much rely on them being there that night. They confirm with us when they're coming. In that case, yeah, go ahead and check in your client into your bed, into your shelter. If they have been able to confirm with you and are consistent that they're going to be there, even if they're not there, but you can expect them to be there and they confirm with you, then go ahead and check them into your ShelterPoint list so that they can be pulled into your pit. And so one thing to really keep in mind is that on the night of the pit, you're going to be comparing the number of clients on your tally sheets versus the number of clients in HMIS ShelterPoint. So what you want to do is that when you eventually are able to print out to do your tally sheets, you want to ensure that the amount of clients that are on your tally sheets matches the amount of clients that are checked into your HMIS ShelterPoint. So that's great. That's the pit. That's the point in time count that will be happening in January. What does that mean for the pre-pit that's happening in October? Well, we don't have you complete a tally in October. What we do instead is we'll be comparing the number of clients with an entry but no exit to the number of clients in HMIS ShelterPoint. Now, this isn't exactly you may still have clients that have an entry but no exit that are not coming to your shelter on a consistent basis, right? And this mostly applies to those night by night shelters. You may have a client that has an entry but no exit, but they come about 5 nights out of the week instead of being there reliably every single day. And that's fine. This pre-pit process is really, again, the intentions to shake off the cobwebs for us to be able to judge which projects are way, way off and need actual practice. And it's really a way for your case managers, for your staff to be a little bit more practiced and a little bit more familiar with ShelterPoint and with the pit process. So we don't have to be as exact as we do on the night of the pit. But one thing that we do want to encourage everyone to do is really understand really familiarize themselves with the ShelterPoint process to become comfortable with checking clients in and out as need be, and particularly making sure that those clients are checked out in the correct way or checked in the correct way if they are part of the family. So again, for the pre-pit, we're going to be comparing the clients that have a current entry but that do not have an exit to the clients that were checked in on October 31st in your project's ShelterPoint unit list. So what happens after the pre-pit? So where we are going to start, we are going to begin by preparing a report to send out to everyone. And once we prepare that report, typically on the day after or 2 days after, we'll send the ATA an email featuring all the clients that were checked in at that time. This report is also going to be available in ART if you want to run it independently. We also encourage agencies to review the results with their staff to see who may or may not be missing. One thing that we are going to examine on the HMIS side, if you have a client that has, we're going to be comparing dates here. And what I mean by that is that if you have a client that's been checked into ShelterPoint back in 2017, we can presume that you've never removed that client from ShelterPoint. And if you're running an emergency shelter and this person still has an active entry in your ShelterPoint list from 2017, that's probably not the case. That client is probably long gone, and that's something that we're going to flag for you, and that's something that we're going to want you to address. So what we're really looking for are those clients that have a long time at your shelter that still seem like they're checked in for far longer than they probably actually have been. And in addition to that, we're going to be looking for really significant mismatches between the clients that have an entry but no exit and the clients that are in your HMIS shelter point. It's not anything where we're going to say you're off by 1 or you're off by 2. Those aren't as significant, but if the clients that have a currently open entry is 30 records smaller than the clients that were checked into your shelter point for that night, that means you have a problem. That means that there are 30 extra clients in your shelter point list than you actually have enrolled in your project, and you have to look through those clients and remove them as need be. So again, like I had gone through, these are the projects that participate in the PIT sheltered count. And it's the same thing for those of you that will be participating in the pre-pit as well. So again, it's Safe Haven, and that's not a safe haven. That's not the organization a safe haven. It's the model type. There's only about 3 projects that operate safe havens. You know if your project, you will know that your project is safe haven because again, there's so few in our continuum. And then, of course, transitional housing and emergency shelters, and then interim housing. But again, be aware that interim housing is specifically a Chicago program model. It's typically, if you call yourself an interim housing project, you are actually likely, in the eyes of HUD, a transitional housing or emergency shelter. And if you wonder what your project type is, you can check it out on our help desk by clicking on this link that shows you the various agency project types by agency. All right, so what data gets filtered into this pre-pit list? So the data that we use for the sheltered count is pulling from 2 sources. One are a few fields on the client's entry assessment. So that's date of birth, race, ethnicity, gender, veteran status, disabilities, and housing situation, which is fairly a lot. And then we have the ShelterPoint data, and ShelterPoint is its own module in ServicePoint. You check clients in, and we'll be looking at what ShelterPoint looks like in case you've never used it. So before we go into the live examples, I want to talk a little bit about how this year's 2019 PIT process had occurred and how it went down. So for the first time ever, we were able to source all sheltered PIT data almost exclusively from HMIS. There were a few projects where we had to use their written tallies as opposed to HMIS data, but it was less than 5 projects. The majority of agencies out there, the majority of projects out there, were totally within the margin of error that we were comfortable with to use HMIS data. So it was a huge boon and a huge win for our continuum, and to eventually try to move towards a system where we don't have this many redundancies with tallies and things of that nature. So of those 5 projects that we had to use tallies on as opposed to their HMIS data, we had to do that for the following reasons. So one might be a demographic discrepancy where the sheltered clients didn't match the target population for that project. So that's something where if you run a youth project and you have someone who's 60 years old checked into your ShelterPoint list, that 60-year-old is probably not a part of your youth project. That was probably an erroneous entry. So those are the things that we're talking about with demographic discrepancies. It also occurs if your project is only serving women, and we have a man who's in your woman's project, then that's something that we would call into question as well. Then we also have agencies that just did not participate, and they only participated by the tally count. These are domestic violence shelters. Some providers just generally don't input into HMIS at all, so that's another thing. So these are some of the things to keep in mind. Now, for the most part, all shelters do participate in HMIS, but every now and again, there's one or two that may not do so either because of technological issues. One year we had a provider that wasn't able to participate in the pit because of the fact that they lost their internet completely that day, that entire week actually. They just had no internet. So those are some of the things that contribute to not being able to participate in the pit count. And this is a biggie, particularly for family shelters. These are household issues. So for those projects that serve families, uh, one thing to keep in mind is that you always need to attach families together. Families need to be checked in together in order for there to be a consistent group ID between each members of that particular household. So one thing that causes issues is when agencies input a parent and then the child and then the other child and then the spouse all separately. They don't connect them together. And because of that, household ID isn't generated, a group ID isn't generated, and it causes a lot of issues for our data analysts to be able to make a presumption of who is actually in a family. And I know some of you out there are saying, well, if everyone's last name ends in Munoz, then you can, and they're all at my project, you can presume they're a family. No, we can't. There's no way for us to verify that. We need to know that by the group ID. We need you to confirm that for us. What we end up seeing is a spreadsheet, and we don't feel comfortable making assumptions on your data. So this is the real importance of checking in families accurately and together. Then we have missing demographics. This is stuff where folks just forgot to enter their race, their gender, ethnicity, etc. And then here's another issue that we encountered sometimes for those projects that where we had to use their tallies. It could be that the total served was, it could be that the total served on the tallies was significantly different from the total served in ShelterPoint. So again, it's going back to that previous image I had presented, essentially equating that your tally should be matching your ShelterPoint list. So now let's talk a little bit about the general data entry process into HMIS for this. So a few general rules to keep in mind, and mind you, we're going to do some live demonstrations shortly. You want to ensure that all your clients are staying in the project. All clients staying in your project have a complete entry. So you want to make sure that they've wrapped up their entry assessment. You have all pieces of their entry assessment done and over with, because all of that gets pulled into your client's gets pulled into the PIT report. You also want to ensure that your ShelterPoint bed list is completely up to date. Look at this well before the date of the shelter count and remove any clients in ShelterPoint that are no longer in your project. And one thing to note when we talk about ShelterPoint, it's usually easier for transitional housing, safe havens, and interim housing projects to do this for their client, to clean up the ShelterPoint list, because they know that clients will be coming in on a really pretty consistent basis. Sometimes they have rules where you can't miss a day, or else you know, you're not allowed to miss more than one day or something of that sort. So these are some of the things that will make it easier for transitional housing, safe haven, and interim housing projects to be able to participate in the PIT, because some emergency shelters that particularly operate night by night, you don't know who's going to be showing up. You have a core group of folks that you know will show up, but there may be other people sprinkled in, etc. So it's going to be a little harder for the night by night shelters, but for transitional housing, interim housing, and safe haven projects, this will be pretty easy, because you can predict that those folks are going to be returning consistently. So a few things to keep in mind for ShelterPoint. Any clients that are no longer at your project should be removed from the bed list. Clients that do not fit the demographics of your program should also be removed or placed in the right program. So again, if you have a project that only serves women, but you have a man checked into your ShelterPoint list, which can happen. Maybe whoever was doing the data entry missed the client ID by one, and and erroneously selected a man, something of that sort. Now there are instances where it may be a transgender man, transgender male, something of the sort, gender non-conforming person. But really, the gist of it is, if you're if your project's serving only women, then you should ensure that there are probably only women in your ShelterPoint list, barring those instances where it may be someone who's transgendered or gender non-conforming. And here I use an example of date of birth. Someone who's 60 years old shouldn't be in a project designated for youth. And then clients that operate in households, so a family or a couple, anything of that sort, they should have a group ID. And I'm going to show you where you can find that group ID when we check in our clients into our project. And so let's talk a little bit about the entry assessment checklist. Your client should have the following at entry. They should be entered into your correct project, right? There we go, same rules as before. And then you should answer the demographics, the chronic homelessness questions, the veteran status and disability questions for that client. So when we say these should be completed at the very least, if you remember, emergency shelters, the timeliness rules indicate that you have to enter your client into your project in HMIS within 2 calendar days. But that only means that we want you to enter that client into your project. That doesn't mean that we need the full assessment completed. You actually have a little bit longer than 2 days to complete the full assessment for your client. So if you have a client that comes in on October 31st and this is their first night staying there, then these are the only things that we need for this client for you to be able to participate in the pre-PIT. And there you go. So it's 72 hours of client entry where you have to complete the entire entry assessment for that person. And so how can you tell if there are mistakes with your demographics or the client's housing status or their veteran status, et cetera? There's a really good report called the COC APR that can really help you determine where you need to fix entries, who is missing certain fields, etc. So I'd encourage you to be able to use that report, and we'll take a look at how it can potentially assist you with some of these data entry issues, or data troubleshooting issues, I should say. So when we talk about projects for singles, there are one distinction I want to make is that projects for singles actually have a good tool set to be able to use. So projects that serve singles have options for how they enter clients into beds. So you can either enter each client into a specific bed, or you can use express, or if it doesn't matter what bed they're assigned, if you're not using the bed assignment to track who's assigned where and keep it consistent, then you can check in clients randomly using Express Check-in, which essentially works where you just type in their ID and the system chronologically assigns them to whatever bed is open at that moment. Family projects, however, don't get this functionality. So family projects, they must serve in households of more than one person, and projects that serve households of more than one person must enter each household together, starting with the head of household. So whenever you're creating something for whenever you're checking your client in, you're going to start off with a head of household, but then you're going to attach the children and the spouse so that they all have that same group ID. And like Ed mentioned, projects that serve households of over 2 people cannot use Express Check-in because Express Check-in assigns it to the latest person, and it assigns it to the latest person and to the uh, last open spot. So let's do a quick demo. Now let me log in. Sorry, so I'm just shadowing my person there. And so if we go to my ShelterPoint list, I have my provider right here. And let me make this a little bigger. So I went to ShelterPoint, which is located right here in my navigation bar. The provider, I'm going to select my emergency shelter, and the unit list will be emergency shelter unit list. I'm going to click on submit. And I'm going to go through what some of these items are. Now, I'm not going to talk about the check-in reservation, check-in referral, hold all empty beds, etc. These are not typically used, and they're sort of a cherry on top system. If you explore these and they work for you, then great. We're happy that worked for you, but these are not widely used in our continuum. So check client in, it's as simple as you think it is. It's just a process where you check the client in. You'll be immediately taken to a page where you're able to indicate which client, search for them, and then assign them a bed. Express check-in, and also on the check client in, it allows you to attach different household members to that as well. Express check-in, that is where you will be rapidly checking in clients one at a time. And again, this does not work for projects that have households. So express check-in should only be used by projects that serve singles and by projects that don't care about bed assignments. So again, express check-in just goes down the line and assigns beds down the line. If you need to know that client A is assigned to bed 1 and they can only be to bed 1, then you have to, then express check-in is not for you. Express check-in would not work for your workflow. And then the other most used tab would be view all. And let's go ahead and just click that. So we already have a couple of clients checked in here, right? Now I'm going to go through each of these columns. We have our date in. This is not the entry date, but rather this is the date when the client was checked into ShelterPoint. So one thing to keep in mind is that the client's entry date may not be the same as their date in ShelterPoint. What could have happened is that you had a it could have occurred because whoever was doing your data entry checked in the client the day after or something of that sort. And of course, you can backdate the date in, so just keep that in mind. Typically, for emergency shelter projects, transitional housing projects, and interim projects, date in ShelterPoint and the entry date will be the same, but just know that it's not a given that it'll always be exactly 1-for-1. There's human error that could occur there, etc. And so floor, room, and bed, these are naming conventions. Floor doesn't necessarily need to mean a floor in a building. Sometimes we use floor to indicate scattered sites. So you may have a location on the north side and a location on the south side, and they both operate under the same grant. And for floor, we may put north side building and south side building and then divvy that up by room, etc. So just know that these are more so naming conventions rather than actually being this is a floor, this is a room, and this is a bed of that room. It's more so just the structure for us to think through. So here we have room, and we just indicated as suite 504, and then our beds, we added 105 beds to this unit list. And one thing to keep in mind is that agencies can also place a hold on some of these beds. So if you know that you have a client that's coming in later that night and it's going to be their first time, you can place a hold. And notice how the client's name now is turned to held in these two sections. So it's just a quick way of, if you talk with Salvation Army or Catholic Charities and they want to place someone with you, this could just be a quick way of telling the rest of your staff, hey, for tonight we're booked, or hey, don't book these beds out because someone else is coming in. So let me remove that. So I got rid of the hold by just clicking on the word held. And client, obvious, it's just your client's ID and their name. Date of birth, if it's applicable for these clients, I don't believe that we entered a date of birth yet, so that's why it's not coming in through here. Same for gender. But one thing I do want y'all to notice is the group ID. The group ID is how we know this is a household. So this is a 2-person household, and the reason I know that is because they each have matching group IDs. That's going to be super important for family projects. Then we can skip this column, and the rest of these are more so optional. Not every agency uses these. Some agencies use the on-premise function, which just really says, is this person here or not? And same for exempt from curfew. Again, this is nothing that'll help us with the PIP, but it may be helpful options for you to be able to use in your agency's workflow. All right, so let's check our first client in. And who am I going to check in? Well, I'm going to do, so what I'm going to do, sorry, let me go back. So what I'm going to do, I can either add a client by clicking on empty or clicking on this icon that says check-in. And it's going to ask me to search for this person. So I believe this person I created one sample. There we go. So we have sample one, and this is going to be a single person. Notice that in the household count, it's only one. And we're going to click on the green button right over here, select. And this is the client's first stay. So we do want to continue with this client. Now, the date in is going to be for today, 10/24. They are on premise, and I can designate whether or not they're exempt from curfew. I can assign this client to the next bed available. So notice that it wants to put them into bed number 3, or I can change that to be whatever I want. And I do that by clicking on assign unit, clicking the drop down, and then selecting whatever other bed is necessary. So again, some agencies, they just tell us we have 50 beds, we create 50 beds for them, and that's it. There's no more logic or anything of that sort attached to it. It's just simple 50 beds for 50 people. And then other times agencies have specific set of beds or specific criteria for units, etc. And in those cases, sometimes you do have to specifically assign someone to a particular bed or a particular unit. So keep that in mind. That's always something you can do. For me, I'm just going to let him go to bed number 3. I'll click select here. I can answer these if I need to. I'm just going to leave it alone for right now. Codes notes is going to be a good way to, if you remember, there's a column in the ShelterPoint list. If you have something you want to say, we'll see it appear in that column. So if there are any incidents, you can record that here by clicking on add new incident. So maybe they need their medication and they have a letter from the doctor, then you could add an incident sort of indicating, hey, we need to make sure we provide this to the client, whatever it may be. When we click the drop down for households overview, you could see that this client is a single male, so we can start a new household, search one, but for the most part, it's fine. There are no other household members here. This is a single male for single people. So we're going to click on save and exit. And there we go. So now our client is checked into this project. When I click on codes and notes, you can see that hovering over it, I didn't even click it. Hovering over it, I now see my note. So this is a good way if you have people looking at ShelterPoint every night, they can add notes as need be. Now I want to go ahead and let's actually go to sample one's entry assessment. So what I did was clicked on sample one's name, client. And notice here we have several tabs. So we have the stay data, and then we also have entry exit. And you can open up their entry/exit by clicking on the project start date right here. We'll continue. So notice I have my client's relationship to head of household completed. This is also important. Their date of birth, primary race, ethnicity, gender, and I have to answer the rest of these. So one thing to keep in mind is that you're going to want to dedicate some time to answering these important questions, which are going to be the relationship to head of household, their demographics. We'll say no, that they're not a domestic violence survivor. And the prior living situation, this is what you want to complete. So prior living situation, what it's called. You don't necessarily have to complete all of the, typical stay or the further information on the client's current living situation. We just need these three sections, these couple sections, I should say. And then of course, their disability. So you'll want to indicate whether or not this client has a disabling condition, and then complete the sub-assessment to indicate what their disability is. So let's go back to our client. We're back here to our shelter inventory, and what I'm going to do now is actually enroll a family. So I am going to look for the bear family. And here we go. So I have Papa Bear, Mama Bear, and Baby Bear. So I'm going to click on the head of household, and that's Papa Bear. We're going to click on continue, that yes, this is their first time. And Papa Bear also has an entry completed for him. So just know that we've completed that portion of the PIT workflow. So the date in, I'm going to say that yes, it is 10/24. They are on premise. Say Papa Bear is excused from exempt from curfew. The unit name, we're going to go special with the Bear family. We're going to give them bed 8 because that's a 3 bunk. We'll do select. They don't have any codes or notes, nothing of the sort. So now one thing to keep in mind is that you want to look at the household members section. Notice here, the only name checked off is Papa Bear and assigned unit is grayed out. That's because I've already assigned a unit to Papa Bear right up here. We have to check off Baby Bear. And yes, we know that it is Baby Bear's first stay and Mama Bear. And that's still not enough. What we have to do at this point is click assign unit for Baby Bear. And again, what did I assign Papa Bear? I assigned him bed 08, so we'll say bed 09 for Baby Bear. And notice now I've completed it because Suite 504, bed 9 is next to Baby Bear's name. And Mama Bear, she's going to be in bed number 10. So we'll click on save and exit. And there we go. So now we have documented our family, and notice that the group ID is consistent. It's 35. So this is exactly what we want to do. This is the ideal way that you'd be completing the data entry. Now, let's say Mark and Jenny are no longer staying at this project. We have to check them out. So what I'll do there, I'm going to click on, let's go with Mark. So I clicked on the checkout button for Mark. The date out will be on 10/24. We'll say yes, he returned supplies. And again, just like we talked through with the Bear family, look at household members. Only Mark's name is checked off. We want to check off both names. That's what we need to do. Otherwise, we're going to still have Jenny checked into the ShelterPoint list and not Mark. And that is what causes a lot of issues because people think they're checking out the entire family, but they have not checked off the full names. You need to check off every single name associated with this household. So if there's an incident for Mark, you can add one if there is one as they leave. So maybe they were ejected for violence or whatever it may be. So we can click on save and exit. And we have correctly exited Mark and Jane. Excuse me. So there we go, folks. This is a little bit on what you'll be doing and the type of cleanup that you'll be maintaining when looking at your ShelterPoint list. So we have plenty of resources for you. So before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit more about the pre-pit. So the pre-pit will be occurring on Thursday, October 31st, and the HMIS team will be sending you your reports either that following Friday or Monday, depending on our ability to develop the reports and send them out. So all HMIS data must be up to date by midnight. That's sort of our cutoff time. Now, if you know that a client's going to come in, but they requested to stay out late for work or whatever it may be, then please check them into ShelterPoint. If you can rely on them to come in, and if they sort of reserve their spot, then yeah, go ahead and check them into ShelterPoint. Now, if this was the pit, I'd ask you to look at the number of clients on your tally sheets versus the number of clients in HMIS ShelterPoint, but that's not the case. So really, it's going to be the report that we send you when you'll be able to know how far off you were with your clients. And so here are some resources for you to be able to use. You can always email me at smunoz@allchicago, but the more effective way to communicate with us is through the help desk. Sometimes you can send me an email if I'm out or I have a I have a barrage of emails. I may be slow to get to you, but when you email HMIS at All Chicago, it goes to our entire team and we're able to divvy it up and solve your case that much quicker. So I encourage everyone to use the email for HMIS at All Chicago. One thing to also note is that we have plenty of articles on ShelterPoint. So if we click onto that, we have an introduction to ShelterPoint, a ShelterPoint guide. You can see it's pretty long. We have several training snippets, so a short video on how to check in a client, a short video on checking out a single client, multiple household IDs, etc. So these are live demonstrations. They're going to be good for you to be able to check out and use these as references. None of them are that long. They all fall under, I think it's about 7 minutes. I, they may even be shorter. Here you could see that this one is 2 minutes, etc. So they're really fast. Then you have, article on how to correct your point in time counts, checking in multi-person households into ShelterPoint, removing clients from your ShelterPoint unit list. So these are all really important for you to be able to know, and just know that we have something written up for them in case you do forget. And then one final thing that I want to touch base on is the fact that there is also going to be this new HIC component. So in years prior, the HIC was only encapsulated to the very end of January. So not only did you have to worry about the pit, you also had to complete your HIC forms on top of all these other reporting requirements. This time around, we're opening up the HIC a little earlier so people can get at least some of that done. There's a webinar occurring on October 31st during the workday to go over what this new HIC process is going to be like. And for those of you that aren't in the know, the HIC is the housing inventory count, and all projects actually have to participate in them. So if you're a permanent supportive housing, permanent housing, emergency shelter, interim housing, transitional housing, anything where you have units and beds, you have to participate in the HIC. So with that having been said, we are also going to be, as the pit date gets closer, in December, we will be uploading a training series to our Talent LMS, where you and your employees will be able to do your training at your leisure. So before, in years prior, we mandated that everyone had to go through a webinar or two. So we had, a webinar every week in the month and a half leading up to the actual pit date. This time around, it's going to be a self-taught course. Well, not a course, it's just going to be a self-taught video with a couple of questions at the end to make sure that you retain some of the information. So keep that in mind. We'll be sending out the link to that later this year. So our commitment's to try to get that out by December 15th. Now, I don't see any questions that have come in quite yet, so we're at the end of our time, but we have a little time left for questions. So I'm going to give folks about a minute to send in your questions. And if I happen to end this webinar before you are able to type up your question, feel free to shoot me an email. So I haven't had anything come in yet, so we're going to go ahead and end off today. Thank you so much, folks, and have a great one. This video will be available on our help desk. We'll be posting it up within the coming days and sending it out to the general community. Thanks so much.